So the format of today, because we're talking about science, I thought it best to introduce you to quite a few, I think I would probably term scientific heroes. There are some people out there that are really top of their field, cutting edge, that are really strong advocates for whether it's Christianity. I mean, they're all, in fairness, they're all Christian, but they're all under the scientific framework. It's all more, it's better positioned as intelligent design. Okay, but there's a lot of really strong advocates out there for a creator, a designer, what we term God, and I think that's what we want to talk about today. So today is less about myopically focusing on sort of orthodoxy as the true faith, and really sort of broadening the discussion to say, okay, is it science or is it faith? And the reason why I say science and or Christianity, when we go to the first slide, whoops, I should actually start the presentation. Anyway, presentation mode. When it comes to Christianity, discussions about Christianity, it's often suggested that Christianity is based on blind faith. And there's a real public deception out there, because often what you'll see, you'll be asked to choose between science or religion. So the question is posed to you: are you science or religion? Are you science or faith? Are you science or Christianity? And the positioning of the question is actually incorrect, because it's not actually or, it's actually and. Because people don't think that science and faith can actually coexist. And this is where we actually need to correct them at the very, very beginning, rather than getting sort of sucked into the discussion. Oh, wait a minute, I need to choose from one of the two. It's like, no, hang on a sec. I think you've positioned the question incorrectly, because science is completely compatible with faith, okay? So that's a slight deception. And it is actually very prevalent out there. So Francis Collins is one of the world's leading scientists and geneticists. He led an international collaboration that mapped the entire human genome. This was many, many years ago. For the work, he was awarded a Presidential Medal and Freedom of the National Medal of Science. And his quote, "One of the greatest tragedies of our time is this impression that has been created and that science and religion have to be at war." Okay? And that's the reality, unfortunately, and it still exists. There's this perception out there that they cannot coexist, okay? Which we'd like to demonstrate is incorrect. Now, if I did this Google search, because I did a similar presentation to this 4 years ago, and Google wasn't equipped with the AI mode as it is today. So when I did the same search, I got a different answer, which is good. But when I did this search 4 years ago, I wrote, "Can science and religion coexist?" The response was, "Religion and science are indeed incompatible. Religion and science both offer explanations for why life and universe exist. Science relies on testable empirical evidence and observation. Religion relies on subjective belief in a creator." I'm not suggesting Google is right, but this was most people go to Google as a first step for most things. But again, this is the public perception that's out there. Thank God for AI, because as I said, the result is a little bit different now. Okay. One of my heroes, John Lennox, is a professor of mathematics at Oxford University. He was actually a student of C.S. Lewis. He's an internationally renowned speaker, and he's a brilliant speaker. He's got this amazing Irish accent, and I could listen to him for hours. I love John Lennox. Interestingly enough, I've got clips of everyone, but I don't have a clip of John Lennox because I couldn't quite capture what I wanted to put down on this presentation. But and the reasoning for including these characters is go away, look up their material, listen to them, because they're extremely experienced and well versed in their particular fields. But he's very big. He's an international speaker, an interface of science, philosophy, and religion. And one of his quotes, when talking about as a scientist, he says, "Of course, I reject atheism because I believe Christianity to be true, but I also reject it because I am a scientist. How could I be impressed with a worldview that undermines the very rationality we need to do science? Science and God mix very well. It's science and atheism that do not mix." Okay, so he's really turning the tables here. And when you look at the modern, and often you look at the modern pioneers of science, okay? The people that really founded science. And a lot of these names you'll be familiar with. I'm not going to read the biography of each one of them, but Robert Doyle, Michael Faraday, Blaise Pascal, Werner Heisenberg, Isaac Newton. You know, Newton actually wrote more about religion than he did at mathematics. Leonard Euler, James Maxwell, all these people, strong foundation in their faith, okay? Why? The interesting question is why? And C.S. Lewis sums it up perfectly. They pursued science because they saw law in nature and recognized if there are laws in nature, there must be a lawgiver. And that makes complete sense. Now, as a scientist, what do? You pursue a science. Why? Because you see rationality, you see order, you see laws, right? Whether it's laws of mathematics, laws of physics, laws of thermodynamics, laws of whatever it may be. But there are laws that govern what we, how we exist and how things happen. And essentially science is to understand what those laws are. God's given us a remarkable mind to be able to understand these laws. But behind those laws, what has to exist? If a law exists, there must be a lawgiver. I mean, would you ever pursue a science if you believed in complete haphazard randomness? You couldn't. It's really interesting when you actually look at the history of science and the development of history of science, and you'll really notice a strong connection between those of faith and those cultures that lacked that, and how they really lagged behind the development of science. Because it's for that very fact, people saw laws, they saw order, and they had a desire to actually pursue and understand what that order was. The question, does science have all the answers? This is a question that John Lennox he always poses. And he says, they think it does, but it actually fails to answer the very simple questions of a child. Where did we come from? What are we doing here, and where are we going? Can science actually answer those questions? No, they can't. So certainly science goes nowhere near answering all the questions about life. So where does science fit in? And I always say that we need a framework. Because what frustrates me the most is that you get a particular scientist in a particular field who makes a discovery and says, well, you know, biology, for instance, that, look, there's these two molecules that when they're under these conditions, they react together, and it suggests a sort of a micro or macroevolutionary process, QED. God doesn't exist. And it's like John Lennox says. He says, scientists make the worst philosophers. So you need to understand where science fits into the overall perspective of worldviews. So, and I've produced this matrix, and I've heard of a few other apologists that have a similar one. So essentially the 5 broad categories I say, and a worldview must be scientifically evidenced, okay? Because what did we say at the outset? Science and faith do coexist, okay? And within science specifically, there's cosmology, physics, mathematics, there's biological sciences, there's chemistry, there's paleontology, and there's data and information, and I'm sure there's more. But there are 5 categories that we'll touch on today. And then when you look at the broader perspective of assessing a worldview, you have to look at history. You know, we've spoken about history in the past. It has to be aligned historically. Philosophically sound, it has to align with our morals, our inherent models as humans. It has to be, what I say, perpetually evidenced. If a faith is going to make a claim, as Christianity does, it makes enormous claims, then show me the evidence of those claims. And finally, it has to be personally experienced. So what we're talking about today is this first category of science. And again, you need to test a worldview. So if I compare, for instance, Christianity to Darwinian evolution to Islam, under a scientific model, Christianity ticks all the boxes. One may argue in Islam that it ticks the models, but again, we're not talking about particular faiths in this sense, although you may want to put a cross under cosmology, because I think under the Islamic view there's some very, very interesting cosmological claims, if you like. I think they claim the Earth was created before the universe or something odd like that. But anyway, most faiths that involve a creator would generally tick the scientific box. But when you look at Darwinian evolution, for instance, it doesn't actually, it doesn't have an answer for cosmology or physics or mathematics. You know, what's the origin of that? Who are the lawgivers? Biological science? Well, you could probably give half a tick. Not really a significant tick. Prebiotic chemistry. Now, what do I mean by prebiotic chemistry? So, does anybody here like chemistry? Oh, you like chemistry, okay. So, prebiotic chemistry is the chemistry before biology. Okay, so we also term it abiogenesis. We'll talk about a particular guy, James Tour, who's an expert in that field. Because before biology, under the claim of Darwinian evolution, there had to be chemistry before there was biology. There were chemical reactions that had to essentially establish or create this first cell. Okay, so it's looking at chemistry pre-biology. There's paleontology when we look at the fossil records and the question of data and information. So when you put a lens over Darwinian evolution, it's struggling to tick 2 of those 5 boxes. And that's what we do. We need to be honest. We need to look at it from all perspectives and say, well, how does this really marry up? How does this worldview claim marry up against all the testable criteria? So let's move on. The design of the universe, okay? Cosmology, physics, and mathematics. Who's heard of the fine-tuning of the universe? All right. So William Lane Craig is an American analytic philosopher, Christian apologist, and author. So he's very big in the apologetics arena. He's a professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University and research professor of philosophy at Biola University and School of Theology. So let's just hear from William Lane Craig just for a few minutes.
From the earliest times, men have looked into the heavens and wondered about the immense...
Scientists have come to realize a startling truth. The universe looks suspiciously like a fix. Our existence is balanced on a razor's edge of incomprehensible fineness. From the very first moment of its inception, the universe's fundamental parameters were delicately calibrated so that intelligent life could exist. Scientists used to believe that the Big Bang was utter chaos, a random state of nature. Given time and some luck, intelligent life forms would eventually come about somewhere. But the more scientists studied the universe, the more they realized that the opposite is true. A staggering list of initial conditions began to emerge, all of which were incomprehensibly fine-tuned to allow intelligent life. These are known as the fundamental constants and quantities of nature. These values are so precise, so overwhelming, that it's difficult to illustrate the enormity of these findings.
No one of us has been untouched by our advances in space.
To get a feel for the odds, consider the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. 10 to the 20th power. That is 10, followed by 20 zeros. Now consider the force of gravity. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just 1 part, in 10 to the 60th power, devastation would have ensued. The universe would have either expanded so rapidly that no stars could form, or else collapsed back in upon itself with the same result. No stars, no planets, no life.
The heavens cannot be studied at first hand, for the information rides in on beams of light, the immense, mysterious universe into which we are born.
Or what about the distribution of the matter and energy in the early universe? If these were not evenly distributed to an unthinkable precision, then the universe would have been hostile to life of any kind. How extraordinary that anything should exist. The fact that the universe is fine-tuned for life is uncontroversial. How then does one best explain this incomprehensible fine-tuning? There are three live options: physical necessity, chance, or design. The hypothesis of physical necessity says that the universe must be fine-tuned for life. A universe which is hostile to life is impossible, it said. However, not only is a life-prohibiting universe possible, a universe without life is far more likely. Each of the parameters that governs the universe can take on a wide range of values, thus reinforcing the improbability of fine-tuning. So what about the alternative of chance? Most scientists recognize that pure chance is not an adequate explanation of the fine-tuning. The mathematical odds are simply too great to overcome. Many scientists have tried to increase the probability of a life-permitting universe by postulating a multiverse. They imagine that there are an infinite number of universes, and we are just one member of the ensemble. Since we have an unlimited amount of chances to get it right, then the odds will be in our favor. This move is perhaps the greatest compliment to the power of the fine-tuning argument. For in order to explain fine-tuning, scientists have turned to a philosophical explanation. The multiverse itself cannot be detected, measured, observed, or proved. Moreover, the multiverse faces a devastating objection. If we were just a random member of a multiverse, then we could explain away all sorts of improbabilities in our everyday lives. We shouldn't be surprised when the roulette wheel continually lands on the red 20. After all, the math implies that this is happening somewhere without foul play in the multiverse, so why not here? In the end, then, neither physical necessity nor chance offers a good explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe. As Freeman Dyson confesses, the more I study the universe and the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe, in some sense, must have known we were coming.
Science is bringing us closer to an understanding of who and where we are.
Next one, prebiotic chemistry. So abiogenesis, as I suggested, or as I mentioned, this is chemistry pre-biology. Now, let me ask you all a question. Which of the following do we believe to be true? Okay, so within a laboratory, current day, scientists have been able to create from scratch the following. Okay, A, a simple cell; B, a simple organism; C, a simple insect; D, a frog; E, all of the above; F, none of the above. All right, who thinks it's A? B? C? D, E, F. Okay. Very good. Very good. None of the above. All right. So let's listen to Professor James Tour. He's an extraordinary character, James Tour. You've got to look up his bio when you get an opportunity. He's a very strong advocate. He's probably one of the world leaders in prebiotic chemistry and origin of life studies. But he's a very, very committed Christian as well. He grew up as a Jew, and he had an encounter with Christ early in his college years, as he'll tell you that Christ appeared to him literally in his room, and he's just a remarkable figure. But he's a brilliant, brilliant scientist. He was, what does it say here? He's an American chemist, nanotechnology. He's a professor of chemistry, professor of material science and nanoengineering. He started like 7 different companies. He was inducted into the National Academy of Inventors in 2015. He was named among the top 50 most influential scientists of the century and was named Scientist of the Year by R&D in 2013. So he's an extraordinary brain. But let's listen to James Toole when he talks about just the cell complexity.
So this is a cell. What is the origin of life? How do you get a cell like this? What is the origin of something like this? This is an amazing machine. A cell is an amazing machine. It's not just a blob of protoplasm. Every day it gets harder to have the origin of life, to come up with a scenario, because the origin of life becomes more and more complex every day. A cell is a factory. It has the lipid bilayer, which is extremely selective to let certain things in and not other things. It has all of this substructure in here, these little areas where energy is made in here. It has these microtubules which can form so you can move matter from point A to point B. If you go to a factory, what you see is these overhead hanging machines that are moving materials from point A to point B. In these systems, and the way they do this is they build these racks, but same thing happens in a cell. You get these microtubules to move material from point A to point B, and then as soon as the material is done moving, the microtubule breaks down and then assembles some other place. You say, well, why doesn't it leave it there? Because then the cell would become too rigid. So it just rebuilds it. It's just amazing factory what's happening in a cell. This is what we have to make. If we want to have origin of life, you got to start here. You don't start here. You start with a single cell. Just build a single cell. That's what we have to do in origin of life. Nobody has ever done this. If you've been taught that simple forms of life have been made, that is a lie that you are believing. Somebody told you a lie. That has never been done. Next slide.
He's intense and he's passionate. He had a challenge recently where he committed to removing all of his material offline, all his podcasts, everything, if somebody could answer one of sort of 5 questions that related to origin of life. And I think Oxford University sort of got onto it, and one guy sort of put his hand up, and there was a series of debates. There weren't any really strong arguments presented, but it's, he really stands by what he says. The more that we pursue chemistry, the more that we look into sort of prebiotic chemistry, the more we look into cellular structure. In his words, the further we're getting away from understanding origin of life, it's just becoming more and more complex. You may actually recall if in your own studies you may have been taught about like a primordial soup that, and it's, that is so far fetched from where cutting edge science is, and we'll talk a little bit about it at the moment, but it's remarkable that that's still actually being taught in our academic institutions at the moment, because cutting edge science is long forgotten that for many, many reasons. But there is reasoning why that's still being presented. Paleontology is also a very interesting one because a lot of people look to the fossil record. So Professor Gunther Beckley, he was a German paleontologist who specialised in fossil history. He's also a senior fellow with the Discovery Institute Centre for Science and Culture. Dr. Beckley earned his PhD in geosciences from a university in Germany. So let's listen to him very, very quickly.
The reason that many Darwinists think that the fossil record really supports Darwin's theory are the following points. One is that the fossil record seems to establish deep time and change over time. The other point is that the fossil record is not chaotic, it is ordered, and it is ordered taxonomically. That means if you go up the geological column from deep to upwards and from older to younger, you find overall a pattern from getting from less complex to more complex, from less similar to modern flora and fauna to more similar to modern flora and fauna. And finally, you have this kind of transitional fossils, which seem to be intermediate in anatomy, and sometimes you can even arrange them in transitional series like the horse series. But, and that is the problem, all this evidence granted as best establishes common ancestry. What it does not establish is any kind of unguided process by random mutation and natural selection as it was claimed by Darwin. The fossil record indeed contradicts Darwin's theory by these saltations and discontinuities. So it's not at all true that the fossil record confirms Darwin's theory, and Darwin's prediction of gradualism was not accidental. Actually, Darwin mentioned 6 times in his book Origin of Species, natura non facit saltus, nature doesn't make jumps, because he knew saltations would require some kind of miraculous interventions. And saltations are the thing that the fossil record really documents, are the things that happened in the history of life. The fossil record poses several great challenges to Darwin's theory. One is that the theory predicts slow changes, but the fossil record shows rapid changes. One is that the theory predicts gradual changes with small steps, but the fossil record shows sudden changes with big steps. Then there is no evidence for gradations of one form of one species into another. Furthermore, we find that the fossils are distributed mostly on the terminal branches of the phylogenetic trees, but they lack mostly for the internal branches and for the nodes where they should be found according to the theory. And finally, there is conflicting evidence between the fossil record and between the predictions from the theory, for example, between molecular data, molecular clock datings, between the pattern of appearance that is predicted by the phylogenetic reconstruction and the pattern of appearance in the stratigraphical column. And finally, there are often fossils that are out of place, that are found at the wrong place and at the wrong time. And all these conflicting evidences require ad hoc explanations to explain away this conflicting evidence. And one of these ad hoc explanations, for example, is so-called ghost lineages, totally hypothetical periods of existence of fossils where there is no record at all. Contrary to common belief, the fossil record does not at all tell a story about gradual development or about incremental changes that add up to big changes, but the fossil record tells a story about sudden, abrupt changes, about saltations. And this evidence, this conflicting evidence that does not support Darwin's theory, can no longer be explained away as an artifact of undersampling or as caused by the incompleteness of the fossil record. It's not at all just Darwin critics like me who think that the fossil record poses a problem for Darwin's theory. I attended a conference in 2016 at the prestigious Royal Society of London, which was called New Trends in Evolutionary Biology. And there the keynote speaker was a famous Austrian evolutionary biologist called Professor Gerd Müller. And Professor Gerd Müller, in his keynote talk, alluded to some explanatory deficits of Darwin's theory. And among these deficits, what the theory cannot explain, he mentioned not only phenotypic novelty and phenotypic complexity, which is very important, of course, but he also mentioned the non-gradual forms of transition which we find in the fossil record. So this is important to see that this is already known in the mainstream of evolutionary biology. And so in my view, I think that Darwin's theory can certainly explain phenomena that we have different species of finch on the Galapagos Island with slightly different shapes of beaks of the finches, but it cannot explain how we got birds and their feathers in the first place. Charles Darwin was quite aware that his theory does not agree with the fossil record, and so he hoped that this can be explained away with the incompleteness of the fossil record, with our insufficient knowledge of geology, and he hoped that over time the gaps would be filled and ultimately the theory would be confirmed by the fossil record. But this didn't happen. Now we know a lot more than Darwin did, and over time, with growing knowledge about the fossil record, the problem didn't disappear, it even became more acute. So what's the situation now, 160 years after Darwin? Darwin's attempt to explain the evidence from the fossil record away as lack of knowledge about the fossil record and as incompleteness of the fossil record is no longer tenable. And here's why. Let me first give a metaphor, and this example was coined by my colleague Paul Nelson. Imagine you have a new hobby and you walk along the beach and you collect what the flood washes in. You collect starfish and shells and snails. Every day you find something new, but over time repetition sets in. And ultimately you reach a day where you only find over and over again what you already found. And then you know that you have sampled enough to know what is out there. Exactly this method is applied in paleontology to statistically test the completeness of the fossil record. And in paleontology, it's called the collector's curve. In most groups of organisms, we know that the fossil record is sufficiently complete to be sure that the gaps that we see and the discontinuities we see are not artifacts of undersampling or of an incomplete fossil record, but are actually data to be explained. But there's another reason why this phenomenon cannot be an artifact, and that is, if it would be an artifact, we should expect that over time the gaps get smaller and the apparent non-gradual transitions become more gradual. But what we actually find is that with growing knowledge of the fossil record, the problems don't disappear, but they get even bigger and bigger, and this shows us that nature wants to tell us something. Many Darwinists will cherish every new fossil discovery that can be sold as a transitional fossil that confirms this theory. But usually, if you really look at the evidence is very thin for those cases. And also there are a lot of cases where we lack those transitional fossils. So if those cases where we have transitional fossils count as evidence in support of Darwin's theory, then of course we also have to look at the other cases and have to allow for conflicting evidence where the lack of evidence doesn't confirm the theory and actually contradicts the theory. But even if we grant all the transitional fossils, as I said already, this at best establishes common ancestry.
So we could go on, but I was actually looking for a particular part because when he actually came out and expressed these views with his colleagues, he basically lost his position at the I think it was the museum at the time that he actually founded. So all his funding disappeared. So it was very, very hostile when he came out with a perspective, the perspective that he shares there. And we'll talk about what that hostility looks like. I was trying to find it within this clip, but might be towards the end, so we won't spend any more time onto it. The final one is really talking about, actually I think it's the second last one, the origin of data and information. So if the universe had a beginning, and we look at cells, as James Tour mentioned, if we take the simplest of cell, the simplest of cells has a genetic code. The universe, as William Lane Craig spoke about, there were laws, there were constants, universal constants, so there was physics, mathematics that existed. So the question has to be asked, where did this information and this data come from? It's a very, very simple question. If you walk into a room and you see a paragraph written on a wall, are you going to suppose that was just by chance, somehow a pen picked itself up and text found itself on the wall? Or the first thing you're going to ask is, okay, there is information presented on that medium. What was the mind behind that information? So it's a similar question. If there is information at the very, very beginning, what is the origin of this information? What is the origin of this data? So the question then becomes, if science is so compelling, why the resistance? So David Galanta, he's a professor of computer science at Yale, and he was a very staunch atheist, and he changed his view principally around this type of research. And it's interesting, have a listen to what he says about, it's more around what's the response from the scientific community about opposing evolutionary theory.
Darwinism is no longer just a scientific theory, but the basis of a world view and an emergency religion for the many troubled souls who need one, close quote. Now, lots of people have invested lots of energy in discrediting Dr. Berlinski and Dr. Meyer over the years. You, Dr. Gelernter, are a professor of unquestioned competence and achievement in computer science. And computer science is with it, baby. It is right at the middle of the new world we're creating. It's technocracy. We don't have to ask ultimate questions. We just have to deal with zeros and ones. It's totally rational. It's producing a cornucopia of new wealth. And now Gelernter goes over to the other side?
He's been with us all along.
So what's the reception been
Traitor.
at New Haven and in your profession, in academia? I mean, that's a serious question. What's going on? Okay.
I have to make a distinction between the way I've been treated personally, which is in a very courteous and collegial way by my colleagues at Yale. They're nice guys, and I like them. They're my friends. On the other hand, when I look at their intellectual behavior, what they publish, and much more important, what they tell their students, Darwinism has indeed passed beyond a scientific argument as far as they are concerned. You take your life in your hands to challenge it intellectually.
Yes.
They will destroy you if you challenge it. Now, I haven't been destroyed. I'm not a biologist, and I don't claim to be an authority on this topic. But and a book review is not the same as a book. It's sort of a satellite around the book. Anyway, it remains the case that I have nothing personally to charge my colleagues with. But what I've seen in their behavior intellectually and at colleges across the West is nothing approaching free speech on this topic, is a bitter rejection, not just a sort of bitter, fundamental, angry, outraged, violent rejection, which comes nowhere near scientific or intellectual discussion. I've seen that happen again and again. I'm a Darwinism. Don't you say a word against it, or I don't want to hear you, period.
Which proves that you're attacking their religion, in effect.
I am attacking their religion, and I don't blame them for being all head up. It is a big issue for them, unquestionably.
Dr. Berlinski, who holds his doctorate in philosophy, I want to depart. This isn't strictly Darwin, but I'm indulging myself. This is a quotation that has struck me as compelling for a long time, but for a long time I've thought I really want to try it on Berlinski. So here we go. Okay, I'll try you. This is C.S.
Antony Flew is another interesting character. So Antony Flew, he was a British philosopher and professor who was essentially for decades, he was a leading champion of atheism, more than half a century. And right at the end of his life, at about age 81, some say around the 70s, but maybe his 80s, he concluded, based on scientific evidence, that there must have been a creator. There must have been an initial design, a superintelligence. So let's just have a quick listen to this. It's remarkable because he was a very, very staunch atheist.
In this episode, we will consider the surprising story of the atheist philosopher whose late-in-life redirection confounded everyone. His name is Antony Flew. He was born in 1924 and died in 2010. He was a brilliant British philosopher, Cambridge educated, who after World War II service in the Royal Air Force Intelligence, where he was one of the genius codebreakers who helped the Allied war effort, he became a professor of philosophy, as well as the author of several popular books proclaiming atheism as the only logical conclusion. The book that cemented his fame was his best-selling The Presumption of Atheism from 1976. Now, he had been a colleague of C.S. Lewis on the faculty of Oxford University and respected Lewis for his clear thinking and articulate exposition of the Christian faith, but Flew was unconvinced by his arguments for the existence of God, and his reputation and loyalty from his students and colleagues was grounded in his confident unbelief. And then, in his 70s, he began to rethink everything he had believed and taught. In 2004, Antony Flew shocked his academic colleagues and former students when he announced that he had undergone a mental U-turn. He had come to believe that there must be a God, an intelligent creator. He published "There Is a God," with the intriguing subtitle, "How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind," reversing the conclusions of his former books. American author Eric Metaxas met Flew and talked with him about his new convictions. Metaxas has written, "For him, the facts were clear as a bell, and there was no going back. The advances in science over the previous decades, specifically the arguments for the fine-tuned universe, had rendered atheism logically untenable. The odds of a coin being flipped 1 billion times and coming up heads every single time were nothing compared to the odds of billions of random chance events all occurring in precisely the right way and sequence to produce the cosmos and human life." Flew was bitterly attacked in the press and in print. The venomous comments sounded like people felt betrayed. Some former colleagues claimed that he must have become senile, though his book sounds perfectly logical and lucid. And his response to his critics: "It's too bad that you don't like my conclusions, but follow the evidence for yourself, as Socrates taught us." I don't know if he became a practicing Christian and churchgoer. The evidence on his personal life in his retirement is scant. But there is no doubt that in his later years, Antony Flew, the eloquent and persuasive atheist, became a very vocal and articulate theist, a believer in one God. What a challenging example for each of us to never close our minds to the possibility that we might see things in a new way.
Essentially what we've gone through today, and what I've hoped to do, is really just expose you all to, there are a lot of experts out there. There are a lot of real subject matter experts in all these particular fields, whether it's science, mathematics, philosophy, chemistry. So the answers do exist, and they need to be pursued. I think we're overwhelmingly suffocated with the narrative that we see in society around this fact that science and faith cannot coexist. But I'd like to sort of really demonstrate the information is out there. Ollie makes a really good point. It needs to be critiqued. It needs to be tested. So if there's a genuine interest, we need to sort of pursue that, pursue it with a little bit of rigor, but it does exist out there. But ultimately, when we look at our faith, I've always said that science only takes you so far. So science is not going to, being convinced of this scientific argument is not going to get you over the line. And that sort of goes back to our matrix of faith. It's a real encounter with the risen Christ that gives us the assurity of our faith. So, I always look at the scientific argument's really good at pointing towards, okay, there is a creator, there is intelligence behind, the universe, behind our design, but it's not solely going to convince somebody of the correct faith. So we just need to understand where that sits in the overall framework of a worldview. And glory be to God forever, amen.